Welcome to Earth 2.0. I'm Anita Casalina. Long before this coronavirus pandemic hit, our guest Marty Lagarde was thinking about ways to literally build a more sustainable and a more resilient future. Hi Marty, thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Yeah, no, it's so nice to have you here. How are you doing during this unusual time?
It is unusual indeed. I get to spend my mornings with long walks on the beach with my dog and enjoying nature, and then the rest of the day locked down into quarantine.
Yeah, I know. It's been certainly unusual, but you're known as a resiliency investor. That's how people, at least right now, know you. I know you've done a lot of other things in your life, but right now this is your focus. Can you define what that means? First of all, what does resiliency mean, and why is that the focus of investing for you now?
Yeah, think of it in these terms. What you hear a lot about is sustainability. Sustainability is a longer term concept where over time, and particularly as it relates to climate, you're trying to reduce carbon out of the atmosphere so that we limit the impact of that carbon on the environment. And that's going to take 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Resiliency is here and now. And resiliency is designing things so that a community or an individual or a family or a state can respond to shocks and impacts on the system that are occurring as we exist today. Mm-hmm. Examples would be, let's take a community in the wooded areas of California. They face a wildfire risk. And when you look at that wildfire risk, that community is going to be helping to reduce carbon by being more efficient in what they do every day, but that doesn't impact them from the wildfire. So if they wanted to electrify their transportation fleet and get away from fossil fuels in their cars and moving to electricity, that doesn't protect them from a wildfire, which is here and now.
So basically, let me just interject, because I know a lot of people haven't really thought about this so much. Mostly the conversation now, as you just said, is about climate change and how that's impacting the world, and how can we slow that down, and how can we reduce that. So what you're saying basically is there's a level of acceptance that this is where we are at this moment. This is what's happening. This is the impact. This is, the forces that are acting upon us. How do we deal with those forces right now? Correct?
Yeah, how do we deal with them right now while we try to become sustainable over the long term? Right. So while we are trying to reduce carbon emissions over 20, 30, 40, 50 years, how do we survive during that period of time? And when we are reacting to the crises that we see, whether it's a wildfire or coastal erosion or impacts on drinking water or even pandemics, can we build in infrastructure that when we address those concerns, that infrastructure itself is sustainable, so that you're not recreating the same problem you had before by just fixing what you had the last time.
Right. So you mentioned coastal erosion, and I've seen some pictures recently of whole cliffs that have slid down into the ocean and left exposed pipes, like sewage pipes, water pipes, out in the air. So that's something that would need to be not just fixed out where they are now, but moved considerably back, right?
Right. That's a good example. You don't repair what's right there today, mm-hmm. because in that case it's already exposed. But let's take one that hasn't been exposed yet, but it's 5 feet from the edge of that cliff. Mm-hmm. You want to go look at that one and say, okay, rather than repairing it if there was a leak in it, no, you need to move that, and you need to relocate it into a place where it will be sustainable over the long term. So that takes into account, okay, this particular area of the coast is eroding at 2 or 3 feet a year. All right, I need to move this back maybe a half a mile, and I relocate it a half a mile away, so that's going to be good for 20, 30, 50 years. So that's a good thought process on how to do it.
That makes sense, because that has to do with anticipation then. You're looking at the pattern that's taking place now, and you anticipate what's happening in the future, and you're ready for it. Then you get ahead of it.
You try to be ready for it.
You get
you try to be ready for it.
Yeah, yeah, to get ahead of it. And you talked about towns, because humans love to be so close to nature. People love they build these beautiful little towns, like Paradise, for example. Paradise, California, I think is one of the most glaring and horrifying examples of what took place, that they built that beautiful little town and it went right into the woods, but with the grid being such as it was through PG&E and not maintaining lines, and all of us know about that, the whole town was destroyed. So how do you deal with that? Because people aren't going to want to move away from nature. They're going to want to stay there. What can you do to mitigate that situation?
Well, what you do is look at making that a community like that more resilient. Mm-hmm. What are some examples? And what are you trying to be resilient to? Because one of the most important things to keep in mind in thinking about resiliency is that each community might be different. A community like Paradise and Woods is different than Santa Cruz next to the beach. And so it's not a one size fits all. It's got to be community driven, community identified, and community specific. Right. Well, let's take that wildfire example. So the risk that you're concerned about is wildfires, but there's actually a new risk that you have to be concerned about. And that's the risk to the economy of that city or that town when there are planned power outages. When the PG&E has to cut the transmission lines off to stop wildfires from starting in the first place, which is what they're doing for mitigation, is to cut the power off. All of a sudden that town, the town next to Paradise, doesn't have an economy for 2, 3, 4 days. So how do you survive that while being resilient for from wildfires in the future? What are some examples? You might put in a solar-based microgrid with battery storage. So that is solar panels throughout the entire town. You put a microgrid so that all the necessary connections are to the businesses and the homes within the community. You have enough battery storage to last during a power outage. And now, when PG&E cuts the power off to try to prevent the wildfire from starting in the first place, the town is not devastated from an economic perspective, and people can live their lives. It happens to be now that they're living them in a very sustainable way, because that is a zero carbon source of energy, and they can move forward. They're in a position then if a wildfire were to start, perhaps they would put in some distributed water storage with solar-driven water pumps. So now they can fight that fire without having to worry about the lack of electricity. So that's
so it's about independence, basically. It's about communities becoming independent, both on an energy level, but then in how they are able to cope with these issues as they come up. Like you talk about the distributed water. So they have storage tanks themselves that are at the ready, that are solar-powered pumps to be able to fight that fire on their own without having to wait for fire trucks from neighboring communities, in other words.
Well, and this is where it's I would say they're resilient. They don't have to be necessarily independent. What happens, because that's up to the community on how much level of investment they want to make. You perhaps could have enough water storage there to fight the fire until help could arrive. Or you could have enough water storage that says, I don't ever need help.
Right.
That would be independent.
Right.
But if you say, I can hold off the fire for a day or 2 days, all right, that's a lower level of investment. That's what you get to make. You can say, I want to be, if the transmission grid is turned off, our community wants to run for the rest of the year. Then we'll have battery storage that will handle us for any power outage. We can be completely independent of the grid if it's cut off from us. But that's where the community gets to make the decision on what level of investment they want.
Right. And they'll probably watch each other as this takes place, just like we're watching communities now with the, shutdown versus reopening. I think neighbors watch each other like, well, how are they doing with this now that they've put in enough to fight a fire for 2 days, but it lasted for 4 or 5. Should we invest more than that? So I'm sure you get asked this question, how are we going to pay for this?
Well, and that is the biggest challenge, and that's why I keep focusing on the community level of investment, because ultimately it's going to be up to the citizens of every community to figure out what they're willing to pay for.
Right.
State taxes won't pay for this. There's not enough money to do that. Local taxes and local money is going to have to do that. But there are virtually no communities that are out there today that have enough money set aside into a capital budget to make these kinds of investments to do this.
Yeah.
But we need to find new solutions for doing that. And that's one of the things that we've been working on, which is how do you tap private capital to work into these markets so that private capital can pay for that infrastructure initially and then get repaid over time by the community. Because the community is willing to pay for it over 20, 30, 40 years, which is the life of infrastructure. They're willing to do that. And then they can decide how much infrastructure do they want.
Right.
So how much of their local tax is going to be. They make that decision, but you need to have private capital that can come in and make that first capital investment and then get repaid over time for those assets.
And you were introducing or working with one of the assembly members in the state of California to introduce legislation to this end. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, we've been working on legislation in California. We hope to get it introduced in the next session at the beginning of next year, where we would, the state would encourage its pensions to invest into this kind of infrastructure. And the state has wanted pension money to come into infrastructure here, but it's never been a good fit. We believe that through the way we've constructed this legislation, that the right incentives are there so that we have the lowest cost solution for the state as a whole to bring access to large pools of capital, which would then in turn help the sustainability of the pensions themselves.
It's fascinating. It's really great, very amazing innovation, a different way of thinking of things. And thank you so much for joining us, and we will pay attention, and good luck with the legislation and with getting a lot of people on board to this idea, because it looks like it's very solution driven and
well, thanks very much.
Future. Yeah, thanks so much. We will stay in touch with you, okay?
I enjoyed it. Thank you.